Most people missed it. No emergency press conference. No dramatic announcement. No all-caps post lighting up social media at 3 in the morning. But on Friday, January 16th, 2026, something was signed thousands of miles away that may end up reshaping North American trade more than anything since NAFTA itself. And that's the unsettling part. This didn't happen in Washington. It didn't happen in Ottawa. It happened in Beijing, quietly, deliberately, while the United States was watching from the sidelines. The consequences are only starting to surface, but the shock waves are already moving through boardrooms, farms, factories, and supply chains stretching from Detroit to Saskatchewan to Mexico City. And once you understand what really changed, it becomes clear why some trade experts are calling this the most destabilizing economic moment in decades. To understand why this matters, you have to start with an assumption that governed North American trade for nearly 75 years. Canada follows America's lead, not because Canada lacks independence, not because it doesn't have its own priorities, but because the economic integration between these two countries is so deep, so complex, so physically embedded into infrastructure and production systems that diverging always felt impossible. A 2,500-mile undefended border. More than $1.3 trillion in annual trade. Supply chains that cross the border 7, 8, sometimes 10 times before a product reaches a consumer. This wasn't policy. It was architecture. Entire industries, autos, agriculture, energy, manufacturing, were built around the assumption that the rules would stay predictable, that tariffs would be rare, that disputes would be managed quietly, that Canada and the U.S. might argue, but never truly break alignment. And then that assumption met reality. Because early Friday morning, as Washington was still asleep, news began filtering in that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the first Canadian leader to visit Beijing in 8 years. That alone raised eyebrows. Relations between Canada and China have been frozen since 2018, after Canada detained a Huawei executive at the request of U.S. authorities. China responded by detaining 2 Canadian citizens. Trust collapsed. Trade became a pressure point. Diplomacy hardened into silence. So expectations were low. Most analysts assumed this would be symbolic. Carefully worded statements. A handshake. Some vague language about future cooperation. Instead, what came out of that meeting was a binding trade agreement that fundamentally alters Canada's economic trajectory. And the most important part of that deal wasn't tech, diplomacy, or politics. It was agriculture. Now, there's been confusion online, especially around wheat. So let's be precise. The commodity at the center of this agreement is canola, but wheat absolutely sits inside the same system. And that's why this matters far beyond one crop. Every year, Canadian farmers export more than 8 million tons of grain to the United States. Wheat, canola, barley, pulses, nearly $9.5 billion Canadian dollars moving south through one of the most efficient agricultural supply chains on Earth. Most Americans never think about it. The flour in their bread, the cereal on their table, the cooking oil in their pantry. It just arrives. But something happened over the past year that didn't get nearly enough attention. China, Canada's second-largest agricultural market, imposed tariffs on Canadian canola that reached 84%. That number matters. At that level, trade doesn't slow. It doesn't shrink. It stops. 40,000 Canadian canola farmers were effectively cut off overnight. Processing facilities stalled. Rural communities across Saskatchewan and Alberta saw their second-largest customer vanish. And while that was happening, Canadian leaders went to Washington looking for relief. What they found was silence. Worse than silence. The second Trump administration wasn't easing pressure. It was escalating it. Steel tariffs. Aluminum tariffs. Open threats to walk away from the USMCA entirely. And when Carney pushed for carve-outs or stability, he didn't get concessions. He got rhetoric. Public remarks about Canada becoming the 51st state. Negotiation through humiliation. Unpredictability framed as leverage. So Canada found itself trapped. Its largest market was becoming hostile and erratic. Its second-largest market had slammed the door shut. That's when Carney made the move that changed everything. He went looking for alternatives. And China was waiting. Here's what the deal actually does. And this is where the implications become explosive. Canada agreed to slash tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to just 6.1%. That is not a tweak. That is a structural opening. In return, China agreed to reduce tariffs on Canadian canola from 84% down to roughly 15%, effective March 1st. That doesn't just restore trade. It supercharges it. Canadian farmers go from zero access to preferential access. Billions in exports become viable again. Rural economies that were staring at collapse suddenly have oxygen. But the agricultural win came tied to something far more volatile. Under the agreement, China can export up to 49,000 electric vehicles per year into Canada at that reduced tariff rate. That number is not small. It nearly matches pre-tariff import levels. Canada didn't crack the door open. It removed the lock. And this happened at the exact moment the U.S. imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs to keep them out of the North American market. Publicly, Donald Trump sounded almost relaxed. When asked about the deal, he said, "That's what he should be doing. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." But behind the scenes, the tone shifted fast. U.S. trade representative warnings followed. Transportation officials openly criticized the move. The message was unmistakable. This crossed a line. Because this wasn't just about cars or crops. It was about control of supply chains. North American manufacturing, especially automotive, depends on frictionless movement. A car assembled in Michigan might have an engine from Ontario, a transmission from Mexico, electronics from Texas, interior components from Quebec. Parts cross borders repeatedly. The system only works if the rules don't change midstream. Chinese EVs entering Canada introduce a wild card nobody in Detroit knows how to price. Will they stay in Canada? Will some leak south? Will Chinese firms establish assembly operations north of the border? And if Washington retaliates with tariffs on Canadian auto exports, does the entire integrated system freeze? Auto trade alone represents roughly $30 billion annually between Canada and the U.S. hundreds of thousands of direct jobs. More than 1 million indirect ones. This is what experts mean by supply chain paralysis. Not factories shutting down overnight, but hesitation, delay, decisions that never get made. Companies don't invest when they don't know what rules will exist next year. And agriculture faces the same exposure. Canadian grain doesn't flow south because of politics. It flows because the infrastructure was built that way. Rail networks, storage facilities, processing plants optimized over decades. Bread baked in New York can contain wheat grown in Manitoba, stored in Saskatchewan, shipped through Montana, milled in Buffalo. If retaliatory tariffs hit, those assets don't disappear. They become stranded. Billions in infrastructure built for a world that no longer exists. And here's the part Washington keeps missing. Carney didn't pivot to China because he wanted to. He did it because he ran out of options. When 75% of your exports go to one market, and that market becomes unpredictable, diversification stops being ideology. It becomes survival. China understood that. Beijing's long-term strategy has never been about one dramatic confrontation. It's about wedges, fractures, convincing U.S. partners they need backup plans. And U.S. trade policy handed China the opportunity. Edward Alden at the Council on Foreign Relations called this a declaration of realignment. That's accurate, but incomplete. This is a signal to every U.S. ally that old assumptions no longer apply. The assumption that integration equals security. That predictability is guaranteed. That Washington considers partner interests alongside its own. You can already see the pattern forming. Europe advancing trade ties with South America. India diversifying away from U.S. markets. Mexico quietly recalculating its exposure. Once supply chains shift, they don't snap back. Infrastructure gets built. Contracts get signed. Relationships harden. And now the clock is ticking. The USMCA review begins July 1st, 2026. In trade terms, 6 months is nothing. Best case, a clean extension. Stability restored. More likely, prolonged negotiations that freeze investment. Worst case, collapse, and a return to broad tariffs across nearly everything. That scenario wouldn't be disruptive. It would be catastrophic. And here's the irony. Trump believes this strategy makes America stronger. But strength in global trade has always come from trust. From predictability. From allies believing the rules won't change overnight. That trust is eroding. And when America's closest ally decides Beijing is the more reliable partner, something fundamental has already broken. For regular people, this isn't abstract. It shows up in grocery prices, in delayed car repairs, in factories downsizing because parts cost more, in farmers unsure whether to plant. Supply chain paralysis isn't one dramatic collapse. It's 1,000 small freezes happening quietly, everywhere. Carney acted because waiting wasn't an option, and now the entire North American system has to adapt. The real question isn't whether this was controversial. It's whether it's reversible. Because once trust breaks, rebuilding it takes far longer than destroying it. And right now, the world is reorganizing around the assumption that Washington can't be relied on. When the supply chains finish shifting, when the infrastructure is locked in, when the contracts are signed, we may wake up and realize American economic dominance didn't collapse loudly. It slipped away quietly. That's the real story behind this deal. Not EVs, not canola, but the slow reordering of the global economy. And 6 months from now, when the USMCA review begins, we'll find out whether this damage can be contained or whether we're already past the point of no return. If this breakdown helped you see what's really happening behind the headlines, stay with the channel. This story isn't ending anytime soon, and the next chapter may be even bigger.